We are taught in school to read. Being a good reader usually means being a good silent reader. Our society tends to view silent reading as a more advanced skill than reading aloud, and in some ways it does require more concentration and discipline. But I believe we've forgotten just how vital reading aloud is to our experience of literature, not only when we're young, but throughout our lives. There's a German novel by Bernhard Schlink called Der Vorleser. The English translation of that novel and a movie adaptation of it starring Kate Winslet appeared under the title The Reader. But the English title, The Reader, is misleading because in German, a Vorleser is someone who reads aloud. In English, a reader usually is someone who simply reads. We lack a word in English for someone who reads aloud. The word lecturer, which you might think of as a possible word here, usually has the added meaning of public speaker or teacher, and Vorleser doesn't have to mean either of those things. In any case, the distinction between reading and reading aloud is crucial in Schlink's novel. Some of the most vivid memories from my school days are of people reading or performing literature aloud. Often the person doing the reading was a teacher, but sometimes it was a classmate or even me doing the reading. In 8th grade, we studied Julius Caesar. The class was divided up into small groups, each assigned a scene to perform from memory. My group learned the opening scene. Caesar has just defeated Pompey in battle, and 2 tribunes, Flavius and Marellus, rebuke the commoners who've come out into the streets to celebrate Caesar's victory. I had the role of Marellus, and I shall never forget how I relished delivering the line, "You blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things." It was my first taste of drama as a performer rather than as an audience member, and 40 years have not dimmed the memory of it. Many of the school memories that have stuck with me are of words spoken in a language other than English. I recall my ancient Greek teacher reciting from Book 9 of the Odyssey. Al kinoe kreon pandon aridekete laon. Or my Latin teacher reciting Catullus' wonderful 2-line poem, Ode et amo, I hate and I love. With just a few words, my teachers could transcend the tedium of memorizing vocabulary and learning conjugations and declensions. Catullus and Horace and Plato and Homer were alive. Latin and ancient Greek were living languages, not the so-called dead languages that people who don't know any better have called them. My high school Greek teacher knew the vital importance of the sound of Greek, or of any language for that matter, and he knew several. He insisted that we learn the modern pronunciation of Greek, so that when traveling in Greece, we might recognize at least the sound, if not the sense, of what we heard. I was lucky enough to travel with my father to Greece in the summer of 1984. I was 16 and I had just 2 years of ancient Greek under my belt and a handful of modern Greek phrases to draw upon as we jumped into a taxi or walked into a taverna. But at least I could say aloud what I saw on the streets, the signs and so forth. And the sound of what I heard around me wasn't as strange as it might have been had we not gotten that advice from Mr. Dunleavy. Everywhere around us, we can see the impact of Greek culture on the world. Any building with columns on its facade reflects the influence of Greek culture. But the Greeks have also shaped our literary imagination, although sadly that's less evident now than it was around 50 years ago. On April 4th, 1968, just hours after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy gave an inspired speech. midway through that speech, he quoted from his favorite poet, Aeschylus. It didn't matter that he quoted Aeschylus in English rather than in Greek, but it did matter that at a tragic moment in American history, he drew upon the eloquence of an ancient poet to express what for America, and indeed for the world, was seemingly beyond words. Could you imagine a politician today quoting ancient Greek poetry during a crisis? There's a reason why public speakers often quote great poets or the Bible when their own words may seem inadequate for the occasion. And that is because poetry and scripture do not really describe the world as it is, but offer a vision of how the world might be. Even musicians sometimes rely on spoken words when their music may not be enough to express their thoughts to an audience. For example, when the Rolling Stones paid tribute to their late guitarist Brian Jones with a free concert in Hyde Park in July 1969, Mick Jagger opened their set by reciting lines of Shelley. The poem he chose was Shelley's Adonis, the great elegy in memory of John Keats, who, like Jones, died tragically in his 20s. Jagger's performance of those lines was in stark contrast to his usual extroverted and brash rock star persona. He spoke calmly, thoughtfully, and from a book. His demeanor was almost schoolboyish, and yet the beauty and power of Shelley's poetry was plain to hear, and in a way, that was the highlight of the concert. Quotation has its place in private conversation no less than in the public arena. As I observed with regard to Schlink's novel The Reader, the bond between speaker and listener is most profound when just two people are involved. Sometimes a conversation can reveal how two people who fundamentally disagree can still find common ground. As an example of this, I'd like to describe to you a remarkable scene from a British television show called Bill Brand. The show ran for a single season in 1976. It starred Jack Shepherd as the title character, a young, passionate, newly elected Labour MP. He's intelligent, and he has a gift of oratory. His one most distinguishing feature, however, is his refusal to compromise about anything. But he soon learns that the party to which he belongs is making compromises at every turn. He soon allies himself with an older MP named David Last, who's had 30 years' experience as a Labour MP, and they make a trip to Bill Brand's constituency in northern England. It happens to be Brand's hometown as well. They've gone there to try to help resolve a labor dispute, and Bill wants David to apply a little bit of weight to the situation. Well, when David meets the labor leaders, he doesn't really meet their needs at all. He puts the interests of his party before those of the workers. So that evening, after the meeting has concluded, David invites Bill to his room for a drink so that they can hash out their differences. Bill presses David to explain why he's lost the will to do what is right. And David insists that his actions are based on what long political experience has taught him is achievable. But Bill is skeptical, to say the least. He looks out the hotel room window and he sees the library across the street where, as a young man, he had gone to seek out books to satisfy his intellectual curiosity. And he mentions his keen interest in the metaphysical poets. So he recites lines from John Donne's The Good Morrow. But he also recalls how, in those days, he was keenly aware of the disparity between his own privilege and the plight of the working class people in his district. A little later in the scene, David excuses himself to go to the bathroom. And when he comes back, he reports that there, as he was relieving himself, some lines of poetry came back to him, as clear as foxes. And he begins to recite lines from Little Gidding by T.S. Eliot, but without mentioning the title or the poet's name. If you came this way, taking the route you'd be likely to take, from the place you'd be most likely to come from, it would be the same at the end of the journey. If you came by night, like a broken king, if you came by day, not knowing what you came for, it would be the same. Either you had no purpose, or the purpose is beyond the end you figured and is altered in fulfillment. Now David gets up to that point, and Bill interrupts him, takes a swig of wine, and continues the poem even more vehemently than David. There are other places which are also the world's end. Some at the sea jaws, or over a dark lake, in a desert, or a city. And then David finishes the passage with the closing line, but this is the nearest in place and time, now and in England. And that's the end of their conversation. Bill takes the last swig of wine, puts his glass down, puts on his jacket, and leaves the room to retire for the night. As I said, at no point in their conversation do either of the characters refer to Eliot by name. But there's no need for that, since Bill and David's shared love of Eliot's poetry is in fact their common ground. Now, Eliot is hardly someone you'd associate with the Labour Party or the working class, but that incongruity is something I would regard as a dramatic license that the screenwriter, Trevor Griffiths, had every right to exercise. We live in a world divided by parties and slogans. Democrat, Republican, Liberal, Conservative, Green Party, Labour Party, and so on. But in certain situations, and especially in a crisis, we must find our common ground not in the party we identify with, but in a shared vision of wisdom, justice, and love. And we must turn to poets to inspire and console us. And we read their poetry aloud.